welcome to Grand Canyon University Canyon Professional Development Session. Today our focus is going to be in best practices in English language acquisition. My name is Dr. Carrie O'Donnell. I wanted to give you some educational background, my teaching experience, just so you know a little bit about me and where I come from. I began teaching in 1996. I taught in the brick and mortar for 12 years and then taught for a K-12 online charter for 3. And then I transitioned full-time over to Grand Canyon University in 2010. My bachelor's degree is in elementary education with a K-12 ESL endorsement. My master's is in bilingual multicultural education. And my PhD is in philosophy with an emphasis in industrial and organizational psychology. I wanted to go through some norms and expectations and just things I want you to consider as you are engaged in this professional development. One is to have an open mind, challenge your thinking. We have to remain open and flexible and open to new ideas, or even revisiting things that we know that maybe we haven't utilized in a while. Other is to have open hands, write down ideas to reflect on or to share. Open mouth, share your ideas and expertise, anything that you learn or your insights. And an open heart, because everyone needs a little grace. None of us are perfect. I wanted to share my favorite quote because I think it kind of encapsulates what we do as educators. And that is by Aristotle. Is educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all. So I always think what we do as educators comes from the heart, and we're also trying to reach the hearts of our students. Our objectives today, just kind of the key takeaways I want us to have, are for stages of second language acquisition is just to be able to identify those characteristics of those different stages. And while we do that, thinking about how we can create a low stress environment where English learners and really all students are at ease to engage in learning. Next would be the teaching and learning strategies. So there's lots of teaching and learning strategies, but it's really important that we hone instruction and use the best instructional strategies and the best student practice activities that will assist English learners, again, while maintaining that low stress environment. And then receptive, productive, and interactive communication. So to be able to distinguish between all of these types of communication and explain the importance of each, and you'll see that how they correlate to the stages of language acquisition as well. So typically, if we're in person, I ask everyone to take some time to introduce themselves. I also want to go over key aspects of creating a low stress environment, what we can do to engage English learners, and discuss culture shock and the considerations we need to make when we have new students, characteristics of stages of language acquisition, and the receptive, productive, and interactive communication, and then teaching and learning strategies for the different stages of language acquisition. So what I know for sure, I steal this from Oprah because I really like that saying. And after some years on the planet and some time in teaching, I firmly and fully know that as educators, we are our own best resource. We have a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and we need time to share ideas, share ways of thinking, ways of doing, even sharing things that went really well and maybe things that didn't, so that we continue to utilize research-based teaching and learning strategies. I also know that we should feel encouraged because what we do matters, not only in the moment, this moment, or this year in our classroom, but for decades to come. So if we were in person, I would ask you to take some time, introduce yourself, because I think it's really important to know who you are around, so who you're going to share ideas with. The first thing I want to talk about is creating a low stress environment. I don't want to preface this with we don't hold high expectations. there's a difference between holding high expectations and having a stressful learning environment. So I kind of want to always put that as a precursor. The first thing we have to do is we have to know our students' background. We have to know, were our English learners refugees? Have they been in school in the United States before? Have they ever been in school prior to coming to the United States? Were they born here and they're just still acquiring English and they're just haven't exited the English learner program at that point? If we have students that are refugees, there's a high likelihood that they've experienced trauma. Trauma impacts the brain's ability to create and retrieve memories, also creates, as we know, post-traumatic stress, which can make it very difficult for students to engage. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because that would be a whole other presentation, but it is something that it definitely we need to know because it will impact the interaction with students and it will also impact learning. Something else that you've probably heard of is culture shock. And it's something that's kind of not always considered or thought about, but I wanted to remind you of the stages as we're going through. The next thing is thinking about how do we engage English language learners, regardless of if they're first year in the United States, if they were born here and they just haven't exited the English learner program. So why is there such a focus on engagement in education? As we know, if they're engaged, they're paying attention, they're focusing. It motivates students to practice higher level critical thinking skills. It promotes meaningful learning experiences. And it will also, for English learners, encourage the use of English for academic purposes. So stages of culture shock. First, we have the honeymoon stage where everything is great and can last weeks or even months. The next is the negotiation stage. And this is where the kind of the newness wears off. And pretty soon students are feeling frustrated and maybe anxious because they are not, they realize that they are, struggling maybe to read or write or understand everything that the teacher's saying. Then there's an adjustment stage where they kind of, that frustration and anxiety dissipates a little bit and they start to adjust, which can take 6 months to 12 months. Although this time frame is negotiable because depending on their past experiences, it could last longer. The last stage is the adaptation stage, and that could be after weeks, months, sometimes even years. Students have worked through the emotions, they feel at ease, they're starting to feel adept, and they adapt to the educational setting. The reason I bring these up is because sometimes they are confused with misbehavior or oppositional defiance because it just depends on a student's personality and how they cope with their emotions during this. So what I want you to consider, I'm going to ask you that you pause and write down some ideas. But how do you determine if a student is struggling behaviorally due to culture shock, frustrations due to language acquisition, or if there may be other issues? They may have a learning disability, or they may have behavioral issues that are outside the scope of culture shock. And then I want you to consider what are some precautions teachers need to take when analyzing an English learner's behavior in relation to culture shock, language acquisition. So if you will, just take a few moments, pause, and just write down some ideas. Welcome back. There's some things that we all know is we have to get to know our students because we have to be able to build a rapport with them because education without a relationship, they say is no education at all. I know that's not grammatically correct, but it encapsulates what occurs when we don't know students and students don't know us. So of course we have to know their name, and you're like, that's logical. If you've had English learners or students from different countries, you know that their names are different. The pronunciation is different. So when I say know their name, I don't just mean know their name, know how to say their name. And even if we struggle to articulate it and say it correctly, continuously asking, am I saying it correctly? It's just the utmost form of respect. And it seems so simple, but it is so huge. Also, their country of birth. Were they born in the United States? Because this will lead into their educational background. If they weren't, that can lead us into knowing possibly, did they go through some traumatic events before they moved to the United States? Third would be the family background. Who are they living with? Are they have mom and dad? Are they living with extended family? Understanding their home dynamic is very important. Also, their home language, also referred to as their first language. Now, I know they fill that out on the floaty that is part of the paperwork for signing up and registering for school, but we need to know the home language. And sometimes there's more than one dominant language in the home. There's many students that come to the United States speaking more than one language. Their educational experience or experiences. How many schools have they been to? Did they attend school if they weren't born in the United States? Did they attend school in their country? Their reading and writing abilities in their first language. Have they developed literacy skills in that first language? If not, that can make the transition into English more difficult. Also, their English language proficiency level. And that ties into the English language proficiency scores. However, we know that assessments, as if they're continuing to learn, that assessment data becomes outdated quickly. So we have to continuously assess so we can see where they are at with their English language proficiency levels in all 4 language domains. Next thing would be student interests. What do they like? What are they interested in? And the last thing is plans and or goals. This is not just our learning goals for the students, it's also what the students' goals are. Every student has dreams, ideas, ambitions. They may not readily share them, but as we get to know what their interests are, we can kind of figure out, what is your goal? Where do you want to be? What do you dream of doing or becoming? So I want you to take another few moments and just think about the following questions. What are some ways that you get to know your students? And then what are some ways you get to know English learners? Because sometimes, as we know, they come in and they don't speak English. So we have to find ways to communicate with them and get to know them. And so how could you modify the way you get to know native English speakers? How do you have to modify that? The strategies you utilize to learn about those students, to learn about maybe a student that doesn't speak English yet or fully understand English yet. And how can you build relationships with parents of English learners, or how do you? Because you may have experience with that. So if you would just pause this video and just kind of jot down some ideas. Typically, I would have individuals share out in a group, but some of the things that I recommend is always, taking time to meet with parents if you can have a translator. I don't recommend having the student do it because then they become what we refer to as language brokers, and it puts them in a role that they should not have to play. They are the student. It's kind of like there's the parent and the child role, and we want to keep that true for the student as the student and not having to be a translator. But if you can meet with parents or have a session where parents can attend and there's somebody that can translate information, that is always really helpful because it's very frustrating, just as it is for students to come to school and not understand what's being said. The same is true for parents, and it can make them feel as though, I need to just stay out of the school setting. That's not my job, and I don't want to get in the way, and I don't have anything to offer, when we know we need them involved in their child's education. and to also know that they have a voice in their child's education. I want to move into receptive communication and what it looks like. And this ties into the very early stage of second language acquisition, known usually as pre-emergent. This is when you'll notice that a lot of English learners will listen and they'll be in that silent period. They don't say much because there's so much coming at them and they're trying to grasp what's being said, what they see being done. And when you're in that stage, you're not going to spend a lot of time talking, especially if you don't speak the language. So the receptive skills are the listening and speaking, because the learners cannot yet produce the language. Or if they can, it's just a few words, and they're usually nervous to even speak. But they can understand most of what they hear because they also observe, or what is read to them. This is also referred to as passive communication because they're engaged, but they're not speaking. So characteristics of this would that they can follow simple, like multi-step directions, like give daddy the ball, pick up your toy and put it on the table. Very step-by-step, simple, not long, lengthy directions, not overly wordy. They're able to do that. They often, as they're moving up to the second stage of language acquisition, where they start to produce a few words and are feeling more at ease, they can answer comprehension questions that are very directed. So who, what, where, why, based on pictures in a story or a story that's read aloud and often discussed. They can usually make inferences and make predictions based on pictures. So that's not something that they could read something and do independently because their reading level is typically not up at grade level. But if you read something to them or show them pictures, they're able to do those higher level reading skills, even though they may not be independently reading. Then we get into the productive communication, and this is where this is often referred to as early production, and this is when students can speak and write. And when I say speak and write, they may not be writing a whole lot. They start writing, short sentences, but the more they're reading and the more they're read to and the more they're interacting, they will begin to use more complex vocabulary. Notice I did not say academic vocabulary. They may have some in there, but they'll be able to start to talk in everyday language. And then they move up and they can start to speak and write in complete sentences. And then they move into being able to write paragraphs. So it's very kind of a step-by-step in the productive communication that you'll start to see them building in that ability to speak and write. And then interactive communication. This is definitely towards the middle production, intermediate production, and intermediate stage, where interactive communication is when it's two-way. They're able to communicate with their peers, they can communicate with the teacher, they can engage in peer reviews, discussions, and group projects easily because they feel at ease in the classroom, and they've also developed that vocabulary. So why is this important? Well, we have to remember that learning any language, we have to include all 4 language domains. We have to have the speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And please know it's not in that order because as we know, they listen first. But it is very important that language instruction is then a part of our content areas so students are developing in the 4 language domains. So they're not always just reading and listening, but they engage in speaking and writing and interacting and within not only English language arts, but also content areas. Here I have a QR code and I created kind of a handout that you can access. So I'll give you a moment. You can use the camera on your phone and it will scan it and it will take you to a Google document and you'll be able to open that. And that will be good for reference for the remainder of the presentation. So I'll give you a moment to do that. If you need to pause, go ahead and do that. Sometimes individuals will take the picture, get the document, and then email it to their computer so they can see it in a larger screen. At least for my eyes, that is helpful. So you'll see on the handout that I provided that I have the stages of second language acquisition first. Again, there's different ways that these are labeled, but the pre-production, that's where there's the silent period, they're listening. Early production, not saying a whole lot yet, maybe 1 to 3 words, kind of short sentences. Speech emergence is where they start to integrate more lengthy sentences in speaking and in writing. Intermediate fluency, and I'm going to stop on the intermediate fluency for a moment, this is where students can basically almost function independently in a classroom. They sound like they are proficient in English. They're not yet. And this is where a lot of our English learners, I don't want to say, hate to say, get stuck, but it is because they're able to make passing grades, but they're still not what we would consider proficient. And where you'll see this is in word choice or being in writing and in speaking, or also their level of comprehension or their knowledge of academic vocabulary that is content specific. The other thing that you'll notice is every language has sayings or cliches or figurative language. Some of it they'll catch on to because they've heard it repeatedly, but that's another area you'll notice that they may not quite be to. Doesn't mean they're not progressing. I don't want to say like it's, oh, intermediate fluency is negative, but they're not yet proficient. And the proficiency is when you have the abilities of what a native English speaker has in terms of understanding the language, not being afraid to write complex sentences, and also utilizing academic vocabulary and figurative language accurately. So I want you to take a moment, if you look at the best practices in English language acquisition resources document, there are questioning and teaching strategies provided. And in a group, I would have you work together, but I just want you to think about a standard that you teach, a concept or skills that you teach for your grade level. And I want you to think about how you would have to modify something for a student that is in the silent period, which is that pre-production, early production, speech emergent, intermediate fluency, and proficient. And this is where not only differentiated instruction comes in, but also the differentiated practice too. Like, what are we going to have them produce or show us by the end of a lesson? And that's going to greatly differ from the pre-production stage down to the intermediate fluency stage. And I've had teachers say, well, I only have like speech emergent or intermediate fluency. You may only have 1 or 2 levels, but you may find that you are in a classroom or a school at times where you will have those 4 levels represented in any given class. And that greatly impacts not only instruction, but how students are going to demonstrate their knowledge. So if you will, just take a moment, and I know that'll take a little bit longer than a moment, but thinking about the stages of language acquisition, the students, where they kind of fall, how do you address teaching a certain skill or a certain concept based on students' language level? If you'll take a moment just to jot down those ideas. Then thinking about the different levels, I want you to think about how you would pre-teach 5 vocabulary words. So I want you to think about how would you create a vocabulary practice activity that would include the receptive, that listening, the productive, that speaking and writing, and interactive, where they're working in a group or with a partner, communication that is appropriate for your group's language level. So whatever level you kind of have represented in your classroom, what would that look like? What would that activity look like? So you want to refer to the best practices in English language acquisitions document for the characteristics of the language level that you want to focus on to determine which pre-teaching strategy and vocabulary practice activity you would utilize. I have included some pre-teaching strategies and ideas for vocabulary practice, but please know, I know there's a plethora more. I just wanted to share these ideas just to kind of get our thoughts going on, okay, what would this look like? But if you have other strategies that you utilize, I know that there's plenty out there. Additionally, I wanted to point out at the end of the sources document that I provided, there's a list of free learning apps for English language learners and a list of free apps that support vocabulary acquisition for teaching vocabulary to English learners. Keyword there is free because sometimes we want to integrate practice in the classroom or even at home. And if it's something that parents or students can download for free, they're more likely to utilize it and engage with it. So just a few reminders as we wrap up. Vocabulary instruction and practice are best in context to what students are learning. That's why we wouldn't use a random like spelling list to focus on vocabulary. We need context. It needs to be something they're learning in content areas or what they're a story or a novel that they're reading in English language arts, because there needs to be something that they can refer to and put into context, because things learned in isolation aren't necessarily learned. They're maybe memorized, but there's nothing to connect it to in our brain to retrieve it later on. So that's why we want context. It also makes it much more comprehensible for English learners, but for all students as well. It is important that ELLs listen, speak, read, and write in each lesson. That's the optimal. I know that we do not live or teach in utopia, and sometimes we don't get all those language domains, but if we are aiming for that, we are going to assist them in acquiring English and learning English. And also this again is really good for all students, because even if a student is not an English learner, even if they don't have an IEP, we have struggling readers and writers in our classrooms. And integrating these 4 language domains is a great way to support them as well. Focusing on interactive teaching and learning strategies are not only engaging, but they incorporate the multiple learning styles. So not only we think if we provide the differentiated instruction that, we're meeting those multiple intelligences, but something else that's really important is that students are able to demonstrate what they're learning in a variety of ways, because sometimes the way we ask them to demonstrate it may not align with their learning style, and we think that they're not understanding it. So always multiple practices and having them look at something from different perspectives, which you'll see that in the strategies in the handout I provided. So today, as we're wrapping up, I want you to jot down anything that you learned, either that even if it wasn't from something that I said, but sometimes hearing something, you're reminded of something else. And also thinking about what is something you want to add to for vocabulary instruction or for reading instruction or writing instruction this year that you could modify for the different language levels. So if you take a moment and just write down any takeaways that you have. Welcome back. I want to thank you for watching the session today and taking time to think about ways that you can serve and support English learners. And I wanted to kind of go over our why at Grand Canyon University, why we host these sessions, why we work with educators and future educators as well. But we want to empower, educate, and inspire our community so they take action to fulfill their purpose and serve others. And just know we can't do this without you. If you would take the time to scan the code and complete that evaluation, we would greatly appreciate it. Also, so you know, we have free PDs. We have a YouTube channel, and you can use the QR code to access that. A plethora of topics that you can choose from. It's at canyonpd.com. We have professional developments on demand. They're low cost. They can be individualized as well. Thank you, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.